Hi, I'm Frostelian, and welcome to my second advanced Unholy guide, where I will be covering all the things I know about optimizing gameplay using BloodTap. BloodTap works by giving you an additional resource called Blood Charges, and you actively manage when and where you use them. These charges stack to 12, and every 15 runic power you spend generates 1 charge. Once you gain 5, you can create a death rune from a fully depleted pair of runes. As Death Coil costs 30 runic power, it will grant 2 charges, and while Sudden Doom doesn't cost you anything, it will still also generate 2 charges. This effectively means that every 5 charges you gain an extra Scourge Strike or Blood Boil, and if you save up 10 charges, you can tap twice and cast Festering Strike. The priorities should seem immediately evident. Use all taps on Scourge Strike for single target, and when you need to AoE, tap Blood Boil. Everything seems nice and unassuming, but there is a significant structural trap. You aren't actually creating a separate death rune. You are tapping back one of the runes you just spent, which will then rejoin its partner after you use it. This means that if you have both runes as death, tap one back and spend it on Scourge Strike, it will recharge as normal with a partner that is still death, meaning you just dephased the set. If you then spend the remaining death rune on Scourge Strike, the normal rune will be left behind, which is known as orphaning. These orphaned runes are an even worse problem for BloodTap than with Runic Corruption, because of how easily repeatable the mistake is. It's entirely plausible that you could tap and dephase a pair of death runes every time, crippling your DPS. Here's an example. As you know, we have a complete rune cycle of 4 sets fixed over 28 seconds. During that time, we naturally cast 2 Festering Strikes, 8 Scourge Strikes, and 4 Death Coils. 4 Death Coils give 8 charges, but we can expect at least 1 Doom proc to carry it to 10. So we have 2 taps to spend on Scourge Strike over this time, bringing the optimal total to 10 Scourge Strikes. Now say we only spend Death Rune on Scourge Strike, and succeed in dephase tapping both sets of Blood Death Runes. Over those same 4 sets, we end up with 2 orphaned runes, resulting in 2 Festering Strikes, 4 Death Coils, and 8 Scourge Strikes. So whilst you created 2 runes, you didn't actually gain anything. And the best part is that you can do this every time. So in this scenario, you are losing 20% of your total Scourge Strikes. But it's even worse in reality, because blood charges are self-perpetuating, it becomes an escalating problem. The more runes you tap, the more runic power you spend, the more charges you build, and they in turn pay for even more tapped runes. So every rune orphaned is 10 runic power lost from a rune not spent, which is 1/3 of a death coil and 2/3 of a blood charge. So not only does orphaning lower your immediate DPS, it also lowers your overall damage, because it directly reduces the total number of runes available to spend over the whole encounter. When faced with the dephased set, we only have 2 choices, either 1 Scourge Strike or 1 Festering Strike. They deal similar amounts of damage, but Scourge Strike orphans the rune, whilst Festering Strike uses both runes and returns them as death. Therefore the best course of action is to Festering Strike these mistakes and accept the loss of the death rune. There are several things we can do to tackle this problem with tapping a single rune for Scourge Strike. First is obvious, don't tap death runes. Whilst being a somewhat flippant answer, it has an extra kink. BloodTap prioritizes blood and frost runes, but even if it didn't, when all runes are down, there is only a 33% chance it would hit Unholy. But we might be nearing the charges cap with only death runes accessible. So we use the second option, which is to push tap off blood and frost. Tap will only recover runes that are fully depleted. This means that we only need to hold the current set of blood and frost runes in a half-depleted position to force all taps through the fully depleted Unholy rune. The best time to dump both runic power and blood charges is when you are holding a pair of normal blood and frost runes, because you can't tap at all once you spend them on Festering Strike since they will be death, but it will only take 1 global to clear them both and has no risk of desync. But it will occasionally bug and tap the frost rune anyway, desyncing and potentially dephasing you. And there is nothing you can do about this except swear loudly. Third is the opener. We want to lead Scourge, then Fester. This puts the Unholy rune 1 global before the Blood and Frost runes, which means that we are spending the Unholy rune during a time when we couldn't use tap anyway due to vulnerable death runes. The focus is always on Blood and Frost, so if you lead Fester, you can't tap or even push to the Unholy rune consistently until you've waited for the Unholy rune to return and be spent without adding delays to the Unholy rune. And this eats into your available time to spend the Blood and Frost runes that are already recharging. So whilst it is possible to use a Fester lead, I find it more efficient to lead Unholy. Tapping to use Blood Boil to spread diseases while staying on single target reverses the problem because it returns the recharging rune as death. So if the rune's being tapped on normal, you'll be returning a death rune to a normal rune partner, again dephasing them. But because Blood Boil is a positive form change from normal to death, you haven't interrupted the underlying rune cycle, so festering this dephase isn't negative because you would be festering those normal runes anyway. So we have all these issues tapping one rune, but we can build charges and tap both runes at once. Tapping both means we can spend them on Fester or double Scourge without dephasing. When using normal diseases, Fester is simply a tool to get death runes, so we only want to double Scourge Strike. This means that if you make a mistake and tap a death rune for Scourge Strike, if you have enough charges, you should just tap the other because you'll be losing it to Festering Strike anyway. This also gains a mechanical perk as you are pushing the underlying cycle forwards rather than interrupting it with orphaned runes. Okay, having gone through all this, it should be clear that simply macroing Blood Tap onto Death Coil so that it randomly taps whatever just isn't a good idea. You need to be always thinking several casts ahead so that you can keep rune types together. But I mentioned desyncing a few times, and with Blood Tap that is generally worse than dephasing. Desyncing is where a delay occurs between your Blood and Frost runes, which is another easy mistake to do if you end up tapping late and locking the tapped rune behind other runes. We need Blood and Frost to always be recharging together to give us the maximum number of Festering Strikes possible during an encounter. Any delays will slow the total number of runes spent, which in turn reduces the number of death coils, reducing the number of charges, and thus tapped runes. You can think of an orphaned rune as a 14-second desync. Thankfully, resolving desynced runes is very simple as Blood Tap. The Rune Formation to resolve it is identical to Runic Corruption, but it's a lot easier to get there. You first try your luck, and if that fails, you just brute force it. So when you have all Blood and Frost returning as normal, you tap once. And if it hits the leading rune, you hold it at cap until the other rune returns, and then you Scourge Strike. If you fester at this point, you will instead solve the desync but dephase yourself, requiring more festers. If, however, the first tap hits the trailing rune, then the only option is to tap again and wait for a complete cap. The instant the trailing rune catches up, you Festering Strike the normal runes. Scourge Striking here just makes everything worse. You might think this is a terrible choice, but whilst briefly holding runes has an inherent cost, you need to consider that every second of desync is a second you can't tap because you would be hitting a death rune on the trailing rune, which is a much worse problem to have. It is worth noting that if the leading rune is Blood Death and you're about to cap charges, whilst tapping onto normal runes, you can use one tap to try and reset here because of the order the game picks Scourge Strike, but you can't do this if it's Frost Death because you simply can't reach it. So I've gone through the ways Blood Tap hates you, but it has a lot of positives that tie in nicely with the talents. But there are first a few mechanical things to look at. The major change is that because the rune recharge rate is always fixed, we have been freed from the need to push everything down as quickly as possible, and this allows us to build and hold resources for when they're needed, known as pooling. If you think with a 7-second recharge as one turn, it doesn't matter when you spend the runes, just as long as all three are down by the end of the turn. This idea already holds true for runic power, as it goes to 100. 90 is 3 sets of runes, which takes about 15 seconds to reach from 0, bringing me onto Dark Transformation. It lasts 30 seconds, and with Hellfire 4-piece, it requires only 3 death coils. If you clear all runic power by the 15-second mark, and then hold it until it drops off, you can immediately coil 3 times in a row, giving the shortest downtime. Pooling is also possible when it comes to blood charges, because they stack to 12. You should be holding charges in preparation of a burst switch or AoE to use the extra 2 death runes on Scourge Strike or Blood Boil. When it comes to bursting, the most rune DPS we can put out is 6 Scourge Strikes, so you have to turn both Blood and Frost into death ahead of the switch. It also helps to know how long the thing will be alive for. If it will drop under 45% within 6 seconds, then you open with Soul Reaper to make sure it triggers in time. As for Soul Reaper, the cooldown is 6 seconds, but runes are always 7 seconds. This means you either have to tap or hold a rune for it. If you don't, you add 1 second onto the cooldown of every Reaper, which adds up over time to 1 lost Reaper every 42 seconds. However, because of this 1 second difference, blindly holding a rune will result in an awkward desync. But it's just another thing to manage, and you might not want to deal with this extra layer of complexity, so instead, you can always put Soul Reaper on the Unholy rune. It's easy to remember, takes no extra management, and will minimise both the losses and chances for mistakes. There is also something worth covering about Empower Rune Weapon. It's off the global cooldown, and we want to be using this when the runes have longest to recharge, which is after a 2 global Scourge Fester. But we don't want to be using Empower on double sets of Death Runes because we have to Scourge Fester open and it will be wasting them. So aim to hit mixed runes. There are 2 things to do with AoE before we hit talents. One is we always need to prepare Frost Runes in advance so they can be used for Blood Boil, which is easily reduced to only using Blood Boil on Death Runes. There is no problem reapplying normal diseases during AoE, but we don't want to be losing runes to Fester to keep up Necrotic Plague, so make sure there is enough duration for it to stay up. 2 is the really important mechanic. We can reap Unholy runes very easily using Blood Tap. As I went through before, we hold both Blood and Frost and spend the Unholy rune and tap, forcing the Death rune to appear on Unholy, and that Death rune is easily maintained with Blood Boil. This means that your AoE open should be Death and Decay, Blood Tap to get 3 Death runes, and then Blood Boil. And when that set recharges, you will get 3 Blood Boils rather than 2. Scourge Strike and tap on the next set, and you can keep these 6 Death runes going indefinitely. Now let's move on to talents. The bulk of the talents are going to be the same. We are only really looking at the synergies between level 100 and 58. Let's start with Plague Leech. Leech works by taking 2 fully depleted runes and returning them as Death runes. It's basically a double Blood Tap every 25 seconds, but it will return just 1 rune if you don't have 2 down, so don't waste it. As usual, by returning Death runes, it should optimally be used on normal runes, but that happens after you scourge them, so the total time needed to spend everything is 6 seconds. But it's more important to get it close to the cooldown, so when you leech Death runes, make sure you get both scourges. And when using leech, just be careful not to cap any resources. Leech is paired with Breath. It works by taking 15 runic power every second and turning it into a frontal cone attack until it runs out. So the immediately obvious points are that 15 runic power is 1 blood charge, and that we will always be going into a Breath with as many resources pooled as possible. And that since Breath will be used during Ring, you will of course use Potion and Gargoyle along with it. I think it's going to be easiest to explain if I go through a cast sequence in the best case scenario to start with, and then deal with the general details. I've broken down the sequence into each 7-second rune set, so as you see I have full resources and cooldowns to start with. After triggering Breath, I open with Scourge and Fester. This puts the returning runes as Death. We then have 3 Death runes to Scourge, but we only spend the first and then tap because we have cap charges. You then eat through the remaining Death runes and tap 2 more times, bringing us to the second set. Here we have 3 Death runes, spend 2, then leech and torrent, Plague Strike, and eat through the remaining Death runes and taps with Scourge until we come to set 3. It's probably a good time to break it to you that if you want a Blood Elf, your uptimes will be substantially shorter. For set 3, our choices are simply to Scourge Fester. This is the basic, non-empower sequence that will get you 20 seconds every time. Thankfully, there is no change in cast order when adding in Empower, you simply tag it on to the final set when Breath would usually drop off and carry on. The only change is not using the tap in set 3 until after you use Empower. So continuing from the Scourge Fester of set 3, we have a mixed set of runes to empower. Set 4 begins with the reopen of Scourge Fester, and then we burn through the 3 Death runes with Scourge Strike. A few seconds before set 5, runic power will be low, so we need to double tap Fester to bridge into it. Spend set 5 as you can, and Breath drops off at 29 seconds. And that's it. You have to queue properly, but the cast sequence is really pretty simple, and easy to repeat. Most of the difficulty is in accurately preparing. There are 4 different situations for Breath. The first 2 are in combat, and are with or without EMP. The last 2 are the opener, with or without pre-soaking. The best uptimes you will hope to get are mid-fight, due to pooled resources. The target uptime using Torrent without Empower is 20 seconds, and with is 29 seconds. If you don't have Torrent, you are looking at around 17 seconds without Empower, and 24 seconds with. And because we don't start with any runic power, the opener is the worst time for Breath. Everyone else is burning cooldowns straight away, but without full runic power, we are behind from the very start. Because the uptime with Torrent will be longer than the 15 seconds needed to cover Ring, you need to know exactly when it will be used and instead queue the runes up so they are optimal and trigger Breath a few seconds before Ring. If you don't have Torrent, ask to be in control of the Ring. The best uptimes will come from good preparation. That means 100 runic power, 8 or more charges, Plague Leech, Empower, Trinkets, DT and Outbreak ready with mixed runes capped. And by capped, I mean for 1 global, because the whole aim of pooling resources is to try to bridge the 7 seconds between each rune set. Any additional gaps will mean you won't make it to the next set and will be wasting resources. It takes roughly 15 seconds to build up to 90 runic power, and you have plenty of time beforehand to tap out the difference to 100. You can start from 90, but you'll find bridging that much harder. Overall, the timers are pretty resilient to which runes you have up at the start, but there is some leeway in the cast order to get similar uptimes. Preparing Dark Transformation gets a little awkward because it requires so much runic power to fund, and the timer will likely drop either before or during breath. But if you miss it in prep, and it procs early during breath, it makes sense to use it, but when fighting for runic power, I don't, because 10% more damage of nothing is still nothing. Managing blood charges during prep can also be a little dysfunctional. If you get to 12 and get a sudden doom proc, you can tap and coil without negatively affecting potential uptime. But 7 charges are not enough to start with because it puts you one behind when you need it. Wasting runic power from tapped runes is not pretty, but you need to start at 8 or higher, so I just accept a brief period of capping. During breath, there are no spare globals to be wasted on sudden doom procs, so just ignore them. Because we are starting with a capped runic power, we need the first tick of breath to be deducted before we can cast, otherwise we are wasting resources. So from 100, the first tick drops to 85, Scourge brings it up to 95, then it ticks down to 80, and Fester brings it back to 100. But it's unreasonable to perfectly judge 1 second, and since breath is off the global cooldown, I prefer it macro to another spell to get the queuing right. I use Outbreak for this because it's easy to line up, doesn't generate runic power, and since you'll be leeching diseases, you know they will be there. And also, breath should last a significant chunk of an Outbreak cooldown. But you don't need to have breath macroed, you just need to wait for the first tick of breath to make sure you aren't wasting any resources. The primary power generator is Scourge Strike. The biggest mistake made by people is to fester death runes well before you ever need to. This is again down to the rune recharge being fixed. We only get 3 runes to spend every 7 seconds, and they will always generate 30 runic power. It is simply a question of whether you generate that in 2 globals or 3. Over those 3 seconds, 3 Scourge Strikes deliver a smooth -5 net runic power per second. Fester Scourge gives +5, -5, -15. In both situations, the net result after 3 seconds is still -15. But Fester Scourge lets you fit in 1 extra global cooldown in those 7 seconds, and with 30 runic power being only 2 seconds of uptime, we are having to find an extra 5 seconds or 75 runic power on every set, and we need 225 runic power just to cover the 15 seconds of ring. Now as for the openers, it's a rather sad story because we start with no runic power. But we have 2 methods to try and get some. First is to find something near the boss in the environment that causes magic damage, and use anti-magic cell to soak it pre-pull. Make sure you get the debuff before casting, or it will block the effect. If you pre-soaked well, you are opening at 95 runic power, so you queue breath onto Outbreak or Gargoyle depending on your run-in time. But I generally use Outbreak because runic power is already there, so we are under no immediate time pressure. The opening cast sequence is different than when in combat because we only have normal runes and no charges. We will always open Festering Strike because you can't bridge this opening sequence when leading Unholy. We will also have to use Plague Leech in the opening set, so the benefit to using Outbreak is that one of the first 2 Unholy runes is a Scourge Strike, otherwise both will have to be Plague Strike. Exactly when you pre-soak depends on if there is anything worth soaking during the initial breath. Runic power decays at a rate of 1 per second. If you get a full AMS, its cooldown will be 45 seconds long, but it'll usually be around 40. And unlike Blood Boil, Death and Decay gives runic power regardless of hitting anything, so that covers 10 seconds. So you can start soaking several minutes ahead of time and build up to 100 runic power when you need it. Army generates 30 runic power on cast, which will push you back up to full. As for timing Army, you are going to use 3 globals before you need the runes used on Army. So Army at 4 seconds pre-pull will give you at least 25 runic power extra as combat starts, covering 25 seconds. Breath counts in 5s, but we only generate in 10s, so going in the 24 runic power is the same as 20. Everything between the 5 and 0 is lost. The other option is if there is nothing to soak, but the boss is easy to reset. In that case, you use a pull to generate power instead. Use both Army and Empower and Festering Strike as the boss goes by, and everything will be reset when combat ends. And of course, use Death and Decay whilst you wait. Because we are short blood charges, we will be using EMP on this first breath just to cover buffs. Your first cast will always be Gargoyle as you run in, but if you are 80 runic power, use breath during the global of the first Fester, since there is no risk of capping runic power on the first cast. Instead, we want ticks to be deducted after we generate the runic power. The very worst situation is when pre-soaking of any kind is not an option. Instead, we are under extreme time pressure to get breath running by rapidly building runic power on the boss to try and get as much of the remaining time out of the buffs as possible. Since we are starting at only 25 runic power, we open with Festering Strike, Plague Strike, Festering Strike, Leech. This puts you at 75 runic power, 1 global faster than using Outbreak, with 3 runes on the board and 3 seconds left before set 2 returns. Trigger Breath during the Leech's global and spend those runes. When it comes to set 2, we can't cover to set 3, so the goal here is simply to trigger DT and fester out those death runes to give us a mixed set for EMP. Then it's simply reopening with Scourge Fester like normal and scourging out any remaining runes and taps. By far the most important factor to extending breath uptime beyond what I've shown here is using Anti-Magic Shell to soak raid damage or the nearby environment during breath. It's also important to know what you're soaking, because the rate at which the damage is absorbed also changes how you game the uptime. A single big hit that instantly caps runic power is nowhere near as strong as a periodic effect that can be used to cover several sets of runes. When it comes to soaking different fights, the core ideas I've been showing here don't change. You just have to monitor the runic power gain and make sure not to waste any runes whilst it's capping. You can make the most of that time to spend any sudden doom procs. I'd say overall, there isn't that much innovation you can do with breath, because once you've worked it out, it's just the same thing every time, and there's absolutely nothing interesting you can do with Defile, but you can do so much planning with Necrotic Plague. So let's go back to tier 58 and look at Unholy Blight. This is naturally paired with Necrotic Plague, and pointless to take if you haven't. Blight rapidly stacks Plague over 10 seconds, or 9 if you cast Outbreak, which you should. It has a cooldown of 90 seconds, which means we need to extend Plague's duration to end as soon as possible after the cooldown. With Tap, we have complete control over Plague's duration, so landing within a few seconds of this consistently is expected. Whilst you can extend beyond this to cover AoE or transitions, it is important that you try to find the closest time to drop Plague and efficiently restack using Blight, because it only needs a 9-second window. The timers break down like this. We need Plague to last 90 seconds. It starts with a base time of 30 seconds, so we need to extend it by 60 seconds. Conveniently, Fester extends diseases by 6 or more seconds, so that's 10 Festers. We have an underlying rune cycle of 28 seconds where we cast Fester twice, so 3 times 28 equals 84 seconds. So we naturally cast 6 Festers during this time, getting a 36-second extension built in, which basically means we're only short 4 Festers. Because the rune regeneration rate never changes, we will have to spend 4 sets of death runes on Festering Strike. Thankfully, it doesn't matter if we fester onto naturally occurring death runes or double-tapped death runes. As long as you put in the extra time, it doesn't matter what you overwrite to do it. And that's quite convenient, because if we look at the rune order of the underlying cycle, and double-tap fester the same pair of normal runes every time, say Blood and Frost Rune 1, what we've done is skip the third set of runes, turning it into a 21-second cycle, and 90 divided by 21 is 4.3. So you can ignore all the complicated crap I was going through in the first section when you use single target Plague by simply double tapping Festers onto the same set of normal runes to get a perfectly timed Plague every time. It's not entirely foolproof because sudden doom procs are adding an extra charge as a blood tap, and those need managing. Going full zombie mode and double tapping all charges will really overextend Plague, and that isn't optimal. The main issue with this is that the timer can be very close to dropping, so it requires high uptime on the target. But that isn't constructive on most encounters, so it makes sense to front-load the duration by adding in a couple of the Festers early on as insurance, and then bringing the times into line near the end. This allows you to do the normal system of tapping Scourges whilst being less likely to drop. Necrotic Plague benefits really well from the AoE rotation of 6 death runes, cycling between Blood Boil and Fester. But when it comes to constant AoE, dropping Plague is rarely an option, so in some circumstances you can swap out Blight for Leech. Just make sure you have spread Plague before you leech, and that when you use a Fester, that you have spread the extended duration before you leech. You can also use Leech to reap an Unholy rune if you are short charges. But the downside to Leech is that it takes 30 seconds for Plague to reach 15 stacks, so you can't ever let it drop off completely. When doing this type of fight, you want to be on a very low duration by the end, as close to 0 as you can get without it falling off. Whilst that will help cover you in general situations, Blood Tap offers us vastly superior control over Plague durations. You can fully plan encounters down to the second if you want to. There are times where we want to rapidly build up the duration of Plague to cover extended phases of AoE or other mechanics. Because we're using Blood Tap, we have access to a very easy method. Reap both Unholy runes into death, and use single taps to pair them into Festering Strikes. If we were to try and increase duration by only using double tap Festers on the Blood and Frost runes, we would hit a big problem. Every set would be Scourge Fester, the rune recharge being 7 seconds, but Fester is only increasing duration by 6 seconds, a net result of -1. So if we built enough charges to use 4 taps over the 28 seconds, we would only get 2 extra Festers and a net result of 8 seconds added on to the initial plague duration after 28 seconds, or a rate of 2 seconds added every 7. This is much too slow. But taking those 4 taps and pairing them with Unholy Death runes gives us 4 extra Festers, giving a net rate of 5 seconds added every 7. With a total net result of 20 seconds added to the initial plague duration after 28 seconds, which is a lag of roughly 30%. However, it takes time to set up, and we don't have enough naturally generated runic power to fund taps with Unholy Death runes constantly, so you'll need to roll one over occasionally, which means that in practice, the lag increases to roughly 50%. Usually, once things get going, you will be able to double Fester most sets, but 50% is an easy number to work with, so in short, if you want to add 60 seconds onto the current necrotic plague duration, it will take you roughly 90 seconds to get there. However, if you already have the rune set up, with a little luck you can get a 1-to-1 ratio, and here is one where I added 90 seconds after 90 seconds. When using this to build time, there's a few things worth noting. First is that this utterly crushes your short-term DPS, so you want to get through it as quickly as possible. But you will more than make up for this once the reason you are building time kicks in. So really, you are merely deferring damage into the future. Second, this is pretty handy for transitioning straight into AoE because you already have your rune set up, and that since we are leading Unholy, there are 2 ways you can preserve the Unholy Death when you need to use Unholy abilities. The obvious route is to instantly re-tap the Unholy back to death after using it. But if you don't have enough charges, you can push the Unholy ability onto the Blood Death rune by spending the Unholy Death rune on Blood Boil before the Blood Death rune recharges, at which point Unholy abilities will be pushed onto the Blood Death rune, which will return as a normal blood, and once used for Blood Boil, will of course revert back to death. As for calculating the decay rates of Plague, during AoE it's unmitigated because you aren't using Festers. That's really easy to plan for. You simply find out how long the AoE phase is and set the timer to end shortly after. But when you're on single target, you'll be trying to burn through the excess duration by only tapping Scourges. But you have to add in the 2 Festers of the normal cycle, which is 12 seconds forcibly added every 28. So when it comes to planning to drop Plague and reapply Unholy Blight, you need to add 40% of the duration to the current time to find when it will actually drop. But there is a general planning problem you can fall foul of. Let's say you work out that you need to build duration up to 60 seconds for a set mark, because you need it to drop off in a 10-second window roughly 85 seconds later. But you start early and reach the 60-second duration well ahead of time. You still need to meet the timer, so your rotation drops to Scourge Fester, with any taps being used to keep the duration stable. But this is a DPS loss because you are now needlessly overwriting death runes, caused by a mistake you made over a minute ago. If you started right but arrived ahead of time, it's probably a combination of longer Fester extensions and good sudden doom RNG speeding up the building process, and that's fine. But if you are sitting there for more than a set or 2 during duration maintenance, you likely screwed up. Extending Plague is all about deferring damage into the future. I mentioned that a little while back, so to explain what I mean, I need a brief detour with some logic and mildly fudged maths. Let's look at one set of runes over a complete 14-second cycle. For the first half, or 7 seconds, they are normal, and we have to spend the Blood Frost runes on Festering Strike, and the Unholy on Scourge Strike. The back half, or 7 seconds, they are death, and we choose to spend them on Scourge Strike, not Festering Strike. But the Unholy is still Scourge Strike. What then is the difference of choosing to spend the back half on Festering Strike or Scourge Strike? If we approach this like an equation and start dismissing constants, we can straight away remove everything except for the 2 death runes. So all the mechanics I've been going through in this guide boil down to using either 2 Scourge Strikes or 1 Festering Strike. But if we crudely approximate the damage of 1 Fester to be that of 1 Scourge, then the total rune difference we are looking at is just 1 Scourge Strike. But when we add in Plague, Festering Strike comes back into play because it extends Plague for 6 seconds. Plague ticks every 2 seconds, so that's 3 ticks. Plugging that choice back in, Fester is still removed, but now we have a direct comparison of 3 ticks of Necrotic Plague versus 1 Scourge Strike. And whilst they are not exactly equal, for ease of use, let's just say they are. This means we are effectively converting 1 direct attack into a 6-second dot, resulting in no difference to the total damage single target. However, Scourge can only hit 1 target, whilst those 3 Plague ticks can be spread to an infinite amount of targets. As an illustration, say you extend Plague 2 times with Festering Strike. You're now short 2 Scourge Strikes, but gained 6 ticks of Necrotic Plague. If 10 adds arrive, and you get all 6 ticks on those 10 adds, you have effectively used 2 Scourge Strikes on all 10 adds, a net gain of 18 Scourge Strikes. But because we are giving away 1 Scourge Strike each time we fester, if we don't get those ticks to deal damage, we have lost the Scourge Strikes. So doing an entire encounter chain spamming Festering Strike and ending with a Plague duration several minutes long is a terrible loss of Scourge Strikes. This is the most important part of gaming Plague. Any time added needs to drop off to complete the exchange. The last comparison is AoE, and to look at 2 Blood Boils versus 3 ticks. A single tick of my Plague hits for substantially more than a Blood Boil, but on multi-strikes, Blood Boil gains Necrosis, and then it becomes almost even. But there is still only 2 Blood Boils versus 3 ticks. So even if you triggered a multi-strike on both Blood Boils and none on Plague, Plague would still win because of the 3rd tick. But clearly the best option is to have both Plague and Blood Boils going at once. So to expand on this, since you can build Plague duration to cover long periods of time, you can invest Scourges early on when there is just 1 target, and then cash them in as you AoE. Blood Boil the whole time the adds are up, and lose no runes to Festering Strike that could be Blood Boils. You might consider the short-term loss of DPS on the primary target in order to AoE as cheese, but somebody needs to kill the adds, and it takes almost no effort on our part. But it won't always be AoE we extend for. It could be council transitions, with bosses in separate parts of a room that only briefly come into range. And it's not like the Scourge Strike damage is completely lost on the main target, it's simply been spread out over time. But if you fail to plan ahead, and get carried away with the Blood Boil spam, losing track of your Plague duration to the point where it's 6 seconds left, you don't Blood Boil and let it drop. Instead, you Festering Strike to extend, and tap Blood Boil to keep the extended Plague rolling across all adds. Whilst that is the best comparative option, you still waste a lot of DPS from lost Blood Boils. The moral of the story is obviously, don't fail to plan. Okay, I think that covers everything. If you made it all the way to the end, thanks very much. It took many hours to put this together. So if you enjoyed this level of detail, please leave a like or comment. Thanks for watching.